Hello, everybody, and welcome to Summer with the Seasons Leadership Podcast, where we celebrate the season of being in the flow, moving forward, and taking actions that are full of energy. Throughout the season, we will bring you actionable advice to improve your leadership and your life today. Thank you for joining me, Debbie Collard, and my co-host, Susan Ireland. As certified leadership coaches and co-founders of Seasons Leadership, we share a vision to make excellent leadership the worldwide standard. You can learn more about that at seasonsleadership.com. Join us in making positive leadership the norm rather than the exception. By listening and engaging in the discussions featured on this podcast, you help us bring leadership excellence to the world. Thank you for joining us today.
And thank you, Bob Jordan, for joining us today. Bob is the CEO of InterimExecs, which matches top executives with companies around the world. Based on research with thousands of leaders and companies, he and Olivia Wagner wrote Right Leader, Right Time, Discover Your Leadership Style for a Winning Career and Company, and have launched the FABS Leadership Assessment, a free assessment at rightleader.com, designed to help leaders and organizations perform better. Jordan also authored How They Did It, Billion-Dollar Insights from the Heart of America, and helped publish Start With No, Jim Camp's bestseller on negotiation. And Bob has a couple of websites, and he's on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and we will include those all in the show notes to this podcast. But welcome, Bob. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So we're going to dive right in. Even virtually, exactly. We're going to dive right in, Bob, with our discussions on leadership excellence. And so the first question I have for you is, I'm really fascinated by this concept of right leader, right time. Susan and I both had 30 plus years in corporate America, and before we graduated and became podcast hosts and leadership gurus. And one of the things we experienced a lot was that there was often, for many reasons, the wrong leader at the right time or the right leader at the wrong time in cases. So tell us a little bit about what you do and the premise behind this right leader, right time concept.
Thanks, Debbie. So the book comes out of our work at InterimExecs. We're a matchmaker around the world, and we've been approached by about 8,000 executives over the past 10 years. When 8,000 people from 50 countries show up, you got to get organized. And so we developed ranking and scoring and screening. And there were some interesting revelations or findings as a result of getting to know lots of leaders, and then having this ringside seat where we would match between a client and a CEO, CFO, or full executive and team and see what worked and what didn't work. So based on that work, we started thinking about this concept we call leadership style. Style is the shorthand way of saying that an accomplished leader over time develops a process and an approach and more of a system. Or put it this way, they do it more so than the average executive, where it may just be whatever works today. And so there were these patterns. And the reason we wrote the book, frankly, was because of the negative, the vast majority of leaders showing up, we would describe as having careers and leadership journeys that were okay, but not exceptional. And that was disturbing. And if you had to boil it down to one thing, we would say it was being all things to all people. And that doesn't work for any of us. It's very easy to say, and all of us will say, oh, I would never do that. But in fact, a lot of career journeys for leaders do look that way. And we wanted to put out something really more for people earlier and younger in their careers to say, look, there are these patterns of excellence, but there are also these dangers, and do well to try to avoid them.
Bob, can you talk more about that? Like, what are the patterns of excellence?
So we gave them 4 labels, Susan, because we saw these 4 distinct styles, ways that there were process and approach. And the labels are fixer, artist, builder, and strategist. So we can dive into each one. They're very distinct. I will say up front, we are not trying to pigeonhole any leader into saying, you're just this thing. The way we look at it is, it's a little bit like DNA. You know, they're just 4 proteins, or they're called nucleotides. But you know, your Aunt Mary and your favorite pup or your cat, all of us are just 4 different kinds of DNA, but in infinite variation.
Right.
And we look at leadership that way, and would say that you know, we 3 on this call, we have individual unique styles in the way we lead, and for everyone that is as unique as a fingerprint.
Right.
What we would say further, though, is that exceptional leaders tend to have a dominant leadership style or a dominant and a secondary.
Okay. Well, let's follow that up with then, what are the pitfalls that you saw?
Well, in any style, I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He's a brilliant philosopher, and he wrote this essay called On Compensation. And I'll spare all of your listeners from having to read it, because the punchline is the thing that is your greatest strength can also become your greatest weakness.
Totally. Yeah.
So for example, you know, fixer is the energy that sees the world. You know, fixer needs to go into a burning building. But if you're a dominant fixer, you have to keep on going into burning buildings throughout your career. You need distress situations in which to thrive. Okay. All right. Well, there was a famous guy, prior generation of business. He was nicknamed Chainsaw Al. He had taken over Sunbeam, it was a company that made blenders. And as Chainsaw implies, he had his success from just wholesale, you know, decimating companies. And eventually it turned out there was financial fraud going on there. So you can take a particular trader style, and when it goes too far, you get disaster.
Yeah. So, like, to reiterate what you're saying, I think what you're saying, so if I was a fixer and I got my identity and I got all my, you know, accolades from being a fixer, I might tear things down, maybe unintentionally or unconsciously, but just to keep fixing, because that's what I do.
Well, it's funny you say that, because one of the first, you had mentioned, we did a prior book a decade ago called How They Did It, $1 Billion Insights from the Heart of America. And one of these hotshot company founders we interviewed, you know, out of the blue, in the middle of the interview, he said, you know, if I put a fixer into one of my companies and it's not broken, he'll break it just so he can fix it. And that kind of like blew me away. Like, what? I mean, makes sense. Well, here, you know, fast forward, we're doing all the research for Right Leader, Right Time. And we had identified a lot of exceptional leaders and in these 4 different categories. And so fixer, we had a lot of leaders, and I thought, boy, they're going to be so offended, but I got to try this anyway. And we would get in these recorded interviews and we would say, so this quote, you know, if it isn't broken, break it. And none of the fixer leaders were offended. All of them, you know, we were on Zoom calls and all of them were like, yeah, so what? I mean, if it had been me, it'd been like, oh, that doesn't sound good, but that's just the wiring.
Right.
And that is the point of these styles. And so, you know, we make the point about artist energy. Artist energy is what I would describe as compelled.
Okay.
To your peril. I mean, I am strongly artist energy. And that's great, you know, when innovation is called for, but I can't turn it off.
Right.
And so I have to be surrounded by people who are far better operationally than I am in my company. And, you know, so my co-author and business partner, her wiring is strongly builder energy. And I would say more broadly, and I'm sure you are both, you know, expert and veteran, you have to have complementary skills on a team or it's not going to thrive.
Absolutely. So this is fascinating. So to take the next step in that conversation, because your book and your premise is right leader, right time. So if you go in and you assess, say that this leader that is but most needed for this particular spot is builder energy. I'm just making this up. And builder energy. Do you also work with the people that are there to say, okay, if you hire this person who's this strong builder energy, dominant builder energy, you're going to need to have around them on their leadership team or shoring them up this energy and this energy to balance out the team. Do you have those kind of conversations with people?
We do, but we don't insist. We presume we're always working with very smart people. Companies that show up, they can have needs. That doesn't mean they're not very smart and aware and being proactive. Debbie, as you're saying that is reminding me, we interviewed a number of organizational psychologists in addition to all of these leaders. And the reason really was we were asking, like, are we crazy? Like, this is a premise and we want to get science behind it, which is part of the reason we launched FABS Leadership Assessment, this 3-minute, free tool. One of the psychologists we interviewed, he said, it makes perfect sense. He said, you have to be spiky in just a few ways on a team. And we're like, spiky, what? And he meant, well, if you were looking at a graph of all of the skills, abilities, capabilities that any team needs, you've got all these different kinds of traits, and that any one individual in the team needs to be exceptional, needs to spike in a few different traits, but none of us are going to spike on all of them. And it will do no good if everyone is spiky at the same points.
Right.
The interesting thing about the modern world is, because there is so much technology and transparency, is that the day and age of the manager who was like walking around and like, hey, how you doing? We're done. You can do that out of friendliness, but in the sense of that being additive to the team, that's gone. Even the leaders and managers must be accretive, truly accretive, or spiky for the effectiveness of the team.
Right. What's coming up for me is I'm thinking about hiring. Because some of the coaching I do is talking to people about, people that they're hiring, how to go about it, how to select the right people. And the tendency, I think, is to select people like ourselves. But what I'm hearing from you is, well, that's wrong, because then we'd be all spiking at the same point, right?
Yes. I mean, I agree with that, Susan. In any given hiring situation, you have, the organization has its criteria. It's got the job spec of what it is seeking. And it could be that it is additive. I won't say duplicative, but it could be that it's additive to what the skills are, for the rest of the team. I'm more the generally looking at that team, that there's complementary skills. My office, I'm looking out in another office here, and there's a very bright team of about 30 engineers about 10 feet away from me, and they're all very skilled in aspects of coding.
Right. Right.
So you could look at them generically and you're all a bunch of coders and technology architects. But of course, that's not true.
Right.
And so within that, there's still a lot of nuance in terms of how they're performing. Part of what I would say in terms of hiring, and look, what we want is the practical takeaway for folks who are listening, are going to view us, for what we're doing today. I would say, have the conversation. If you think your wiring is that you're dominant artist, tell your team, because if that's authentically who you are, mostly for the plus, but also for those cautions, wouldn't it be great if your team knows more about you? And if it can spark a conversation for you to learn more about them?
That's great.
I mean,
In fact, I was just going to, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the problems with modern, workplace is that even if we all were back to being in person and work, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're coming into closer connection or necessarily more authentic relationships. And that is what is needed for teams to perform more highly. And so if part or all of that interaction is going to be by Zoom, God help us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We're social creatures, and we need each other, and we need connection. And in work, there's no substitute for.
And in leadership excellence, which Susan and I are very passionate about, we believe the difference in good leadership and excellent leadership is that connection. Is that connection with the people you're leading and sharing a little bit about who you are, so you're not this just robot, I am the CEO kind of thing, right? You are a real person, and they can feel that from you, and it inspires them to know more about you. Oh, Bob, we know he's got, strong artist energy, so this will really appeal to him. Or them just knowing little tidbits about the leader, whoever that is super important to achieving that excellence, both for the leader and the team, right? The other thing that's coming up for me here with this is the right time piece of this, right? So I had a colleague once that liked to say, when leadership changes happen, oftentimes it's because there's a cycle to what an organization goes through. And during that cycle, there's a time when someone has to be the one who comes in and creates the organization or focuses it in a certain way, or and then what comes behind them is the builder of roads and schools and the infrastructure and the processes and so on and so forth. And it goes through these cycles. And so does that resonate with you? And tell me about the right time part of your equation.
Oh, it completely resonates. And as you're saying it, it reminds me of one of the leaders we interviewed. His name's Michael Sonnenfeld. He's founder of something called Tiger 21, which is it's like Vistage for wealthy people, and it's a community and groups. And he had a phenomenal career before that in real estate development. And we had a set format for these interviews of trying to get at the kind of core wiring of a leader, and didn't want to bias it by saying up front, hey, we've got this new theory, fixer, artist, builder, strategist, who are you? We didn't want to do that from the get-go. So, we got done a lot of exploratory questions. Then we would say, this is what the theory is. How does it grab you? And do you see one of you in that, any reactions in terms of your businesses? When Michael heard fixer, artist, builder, strategist, he said, I'm thinking about this. He said, I was an investor in a company and it was in crisis. And the CEO was phenomenal. He said, but once the crisis passed, he wasn't so good anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And can you relate to that? Which is just, this is the way the world is. And it is not to say of any of us, oh, you have a limited shelf life. You have your use and that's it. The way the world is now, it is not necessarily the end of you at one company. Although, most of us, my daughters are in their 20s, and what are the stats on how many different changes they will have in job and potentially in career in their lifetime, in coming years. So, I have to say, the book we wrote, Right Leader, Right Time, could not have been written 30 years ago. The world was not organized in such a way that if you had your genius, your expertise, say in fixer energy, that was so much of a transportable skill.
Right.
Like you could have, like if you were at a big company, like one of the executives who we were writing about, he was in a very large global ad agency, and he was troubleshooting from country to country over a span of years, and he could do that. And once he solved one country's problems, with the client relationships, he could move on. But the modern world is now so much more organized for you to be able to move with your unique genius, and not necessarily have to stay at the same company.
That's just profound, Bob. Because I see it. I was at the Boeing company for 30 years, and it was a whole different thing. I loved it, and and it was not unusual. I mean, I wasn't the only one that was there for 30 years. It was a career, that was it. And now I did a lot of different jobs inside the company, but now when I talk to people, their minds blown that I would stay someplace for so long.
Well,
and
it's to your credit, Susan, but what are the odds that anyone could last in any company, never mind if it's Boeing, for 30 years? That would be a unique outlier now.
Right.
Maybe you could make it at the post office, that mail will still be delivered in 30 years, but Boeing isn't. The Boeing in 30 years is not the Boeing now.
Right.
It's not. And so all of their people and their needs and those folks and their interests, there, as you know, a lot of survey research since everybody went into COVID. And there's a profound shift. The millennial cohort is not a homogeneous thing. There's an upper and there's kind of a lower. The upper part of the millennial is more traditionally wired like baby boomers, which is what's my pay and the hours and all of that. And the younger end of millennial, that's not their wiring.
Yeah.
Their wiring was very much more gratified in COVID with the ability to be remote and to have more freedom and flexibility. It ranked higher than pay.
Yeah. Yes, I see that. So as a leader, how do you respond to that? How do you lead a business when you are faced with this environment, with people, having different ideas about work?
So it's a great question. And now, because, my co-author and I, we had 7 years of research into writing the book, my answer now is profoundly different than it would have been, because now my answer is, well, that totally depends on whether you're wired as fixer, artist, builder, or strategist.
Okay.
Completely. Because according to those 4 different mindsets, your answer is not going to be the same.
Right.
It absolutely cannot. I could give you one answer from a strategist point of view. And Susan, because you were at Boeing, see if you can relate, because our definition of strategist is leader at scale. It is leader within complex or vast organization where the size is completely beyond personal span of control. Stephen Covey's phrase, as opposed to, we see a lot of fixer, artist, and builder energy. Those leaders tend to be teams of 5, 10, 50, 100, maybe 150. They are much more dependent on personal relationship with everyone on the team, trust that is a known quantity. Strategists, yes, they have personal relationships in the corporation, but it's not with everyone because it's too much and it's too vast. And the language is different. And so strategist leaders, their language always includes mentorship, loyalty, longevity, cross-training, gratitude towards an organization. And all of those phrases, you never hear those from fixer, artist, builder in the first part of a description of who they are. You don't hear it. Well, for strategists, like one of the leaders we interviewed, directly to your question, he said, and this was a leader who had 14,000 people under him, an insurance company. He said, you have this vast middle. He said, the top end of your team or organization, they're firing on all cylinders. You don't need to motivate them. These people, you just get out of their way. And he said, in any vast organization, there's also the bottom, and something's going to happen to the bottom. There's going to be something there. He said, but you have this vast middle, and if you're going to compete in whatever space you're in, now that's your challenge. because there you cannot assume that everyone's motivation is the same as your motivation.
Right.
And it won't be. It absolutely will not be. Someone is there and they're there for the paycheck, and somebody else is there and it has nothing to do with the paycheck, why they're doing what they're doing.
That's right.
How does that grab you?
Oh my gosh, I feel like you're talking to me.
And
You're a
me.
strategist.
We
I
each
guess so.
spent over 30 years at Boeing. And worked together, and we're working together again, which is wonderful. And we're lucky in that we get to work with, through our coaching practice, lots of different types of leaders of lots of different types of businesses. And so I'm definitely, after we get off the recording here, Bob, I'm going to take this rightleader.com, the FABS test. And I think I'm going to recommend it to some clients of mine as well, because it's fascinating to figure out. What's coming up for me is a lot of my clients feel like they have imposter syndrome. And I know that word's been put out there a lot recently, but when they're talking to me, they're like, I don't know if I'm the right person for this role. And if, what if I fail? Or what if people get to know me better and say, oh, what is that person doing in the job? And so I think this might be a good tool for them to have a little more confidence about how they're showing up and maybe what they might need around them.
Debbie, I got to thank you, because what you just said, you just gave me an insight I haven't had before, because, you hear sometimes in terms of strategy and people will say, well, a business or some idea, there has to be an enemy. There's got to be an enemy. And in a way, I think the enemy for us, in terms of having developed this concept of FABS leadership styles, the enemy, it's imposter syndrome.
Oh.
Because what I really hope for people is to get a little bit more insight into your own authenticity, your own genuineness. And you don't even need to buy the book. This conversation alone, I hope, gives somebody an insight into their own wiring. And if they want to take the assessment, great, it's 3 minutes. The spoiler alert for you and anyone else is the final question. You take it and it's going to give you a result. Say, congratulations, you're wired. Likely it's going to say for you, strategist, and it'll give you a secondary probably as well. The final question is going to say, did we get it right? Yes, no. And we want to know, because this is where we're trying to put science behind it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you an example of a premise we have that I don't know yet. I have something I believe, but this is going to have to prove out through tens of thousands of people taking it. Okay. Here's what it is. Fixer and builder energy, we believe, are what are called linear styles, which is to say, for example, as you and I, as we're recording this, there's a very famous blow up called FTX crypto platform, and it blew up, right? And the leader brought in, the court appointed a fixer, a CEO, and this person's career is entirely around fixing.
Mm-hmm.
I can guarantee you he's not working on another company or another project. He is laser focused on FTX, and that is all. Okay. Mm-hmm. Artist and strategist energy, we would say, are parallel, which is to say, artist for sure must work on more than one project at a time. And strategist, almost by definition, especially in a major corporation, always multiple things on someone's plate. Always. So are we right or wrong? Well, that's the kind of thing we're testing out through the research here.
It'll be fascinating to see where that goes and where it ends up. But
Yeah.
I suspect, just from what I know in my little corner of the world, that you are definitely on the right track. I was thinking of, actually, people's pictures were popping up in front of my face in my brain as you were talking. And I was like, oh yeah, okay. They're definitely in the fixer or builder linear mode. So it'll be fascinating to follow that. Bob, this has been just an amazing conversation, and I could probably talk for a much longer, but I'm going to leave it up to my partner, Susan, to take us into a final question for you today.
Okay, well, this is maybe more tactical. I know lots of people who are looking to hire leaders for their companies. Super hard to do to find the right leader at the right time for the right job. So you have a business that does that, right? For interim leaders, and there was other different types of leaders, like maybe part-time. Can you tell us about that? And is it only for big companies, or could it be for small startups or nonprofits? What's it about?
Well, thanks, Susan. So we run an organization called InterimExecs. This has become incredibly popular in the US. When we started, pretty much felt like we had this little niche to ourselves. It has grown up. And so it's now fairly common, this concept of interim, fractional, project-based leadership roles. It's only going to keep on increasing because this is the way the world has come to be organized. And all of us in our organizations are now these hybrids of permanent people who are working alongside contract-based folks that in some cases look almost, interchangeable. So in our case, we developed a lot of metrics around not just hard skills and background and track record, but to try to get at attitude, style, right? In terms of how people are wired, that was going to help us make a great match. Now, in our case, everything we do is, whether you want to call it interim, fractional, project-based, we're not headhunters. We don't do permanent search. A lot of times we work alongside those folks. We have a particular wiring and process for how we do this that luckily works, overwhelmingly. Most of the time we get this right. And it's a private business. We have one of our internal mantras is perfect or not at all.
Oh,
I love that
if we think mantra.
Yeah, if we think it's just a match made in heaven between an organization, and a lot of companies of all sizes are doing this now. For us, it's what's called the middle market or the lower middle market. But if it looks like it's a great relationship, terrific. Let's go make this happen. If it doesn't, let's not.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a confession to make. I lied. I have one more question for you, Bob, before we end today. So the question is, what's next? What are you most passionate about now?
Oh, well, for one thing, it is that after Olivia and I taking 6 years on the book and launching the leadership assessment, no one does a business book because they think they're going to make money at it, right? Let's just be really clear on that. But I do really hope a lot of people take the assessment, because I feel like I'm going to continue to learn for many years to come from that, and that's going to keep on fueling a richer and richer conversation. The other thing we've done, we have this concept called Red Team. When we looked at just the top 1 or 2% of executives who we work with, RED stands for Rapid Executive Deployment. We started running into more and more executives who wanted to save, especially when it comes to fixer energy, wanted to save the impossible, make the impossible save in companies, even to the point of no pay, write your own check, save it. And so we're doing more of that. We're not becoming a private equity fund, but it is interesting to look at situations, organizations that are really in desperate need of help, and how can we be of service here? And they could be nonprofits and other organizations. So it's always very interesting. There's no 2 days are the same, and this is not boring work.
Yeah. Wow. I think, Bob, you're a futurist.
Yeah, I'd go with that.
I
I'd go
think
with that.
so. I think so.
Yeah.
I'm going to definitely be following you to find out what's happening and what I need to look forward to in the future.
You guys are great coaches because you have given me 2 gifts, and we're recording this thing for other people. But between futurist and now I know the enemy.
Yeah.
I know the enemy because it is. We want to be who we are. What's the Shakespeare line? To thine own self be true. I mean, the more that you can figure out it's just you're gonna have a more joyful life.
Yeah. Oh, this has been wonderful. I just really
Thank you for the
appreciate
compliment. Yeah.
Yes. It's been a wonderful conversation. And so I think it's time to wrap up. And I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us for the Seasons Leadership Podcast. We hope you take these words of excellence with you to help strengthen the organizations and communities in which you live and work. And join us in making excellent leadership the worldwide standard by subscribing to our community on Patreon. Remember, no matter what level or role, you can become more than you are today. Visit Patreon, patreon.com/Seasons Leadership to become a member today and start working toward your full leadership potential. We would love to connect with you as we build our community of excellent leaders. Until next time, we hope you enjoy the positivity of this season of summer where you are in the flow, moving forward and taking actions full of energy. Thank you. And thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Debbie.